At first glance, this is exactly what it appears to be. A wedding portrait from 1887. A young bride seated in white lace. A groom standing beside her in his best dark suit. Two people beginning a life together in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. The photographer posed them the way every couple was posed in the 1880s. Her seated, him standing, his hand resting on the back of her chair. Everything about this image says permanence, stability, respectability. It is exactly the kind of photograph that was meant to hang in a parlor for 100 years. And it did, just not in the way you'd expect. Look closer at his right hand. Two of his fingers, the index and middle, are swollen to nearly twice their normal size. The skin is darkened at the joints, almost blackened. In 1887, a photographer would have noticed this immediately. So would the bride, so would everyone in the room. Now look at her left hand. It rests in her lap, but the angle is wrong. It isn't reaching toward him. It's turned away, pulled slightly outward as if recoiling. That is not how a bride was posed in the 1880s. This photograph was found hidden behind another picture on a parlor wall, inside a house that had been sealed for nearly a decade. No one in the family ever spoke about the man in it, and when a local researcher finally identified him, she discovered that this couple never lived a single day together as husband and wife, even though they were never divorced. His hand tells you why, and what it reveals is something an entire community conspired to bury. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing, because the stories we tell are the ones that history tried to erase. Catherine Brashear is a 44-year-old estate appraiser based in Harlan County, Kentucky. She makes her living sorting through the remains of other people's lives, cataloging furniture, pricing antiques, deciding what gets donated and what gets hauled to the landfill. In the fall of 2019, she was hired to inventory the contents of a 2-story frame farmhouse on Martin's Fork. The house had been vacant since 2011 when its last occupant, a 91-year-old woman named Della Combs Hensley, passed away with no immediate heirs. No children. No will that anyone could locate. Just a house full of dust and time. Catherine had cleared dozens of homes like this one across the eastern Kentucky coalfields. She knew the smell, damp plaster, mildew in the walls, the sweet-rot decay of paper dissolving in humidity, white paint curling off the clapboard, trumpet vine crawling through a broken kitchen window, ceiling tiles sagging in the upstairs bedroom like they'd been holding their breath for years and finally gave up. She expected old furniture, mason jars, maybe a quilt worth saving. In the front parlor, above a coal-burning fireplace mantel, hung a framed picture, a cheap landscape lithograph, probably ordered from the Sears catalog, probably sometime in the 1920s. The kind of picture you'd find in 1,000 Appalachian parlors from that era. Unremarkable. But when Catherine lifted it off its nail, it was heavier than it should have been. She turned it over, and behind the lithograph, pressed flat against the backing board, was a second photograph. An albumin print, sepia-toned, roughly 5 by 7 inches, mounted on stiff cardstock. A wedding portrait. The cardstock was stamped on the back. It read, J.L. Howard, photographic artist, Harlan C.H. Kai. No names written anywhere. No date. But the clothing style, the albumin printing process, and the studio stamp placed it solidly in the mid to late 1880s. Catherine photographed it with her phone, set it aside, and continued her work. She didn't think about it again for 2 weeks. It was her daughter who noticed first. Catherine had posted the photograph to a local history Facebook group, asking if anyone recognized the couple. Her daughter, a college junior studying public health, saw the post on her phone, zoomed in, and called. "Mom, look at his fingers." Catherine looked, 2 grotesquely swollen fingers, darkened, misshapen joints. A hand that had been carefully positioned on the chair back so that most of the damage faced away from the camera, but not all of it. Someone in 1887 had tried to hide this. They almost succeeded. Catherine brought the photograph to Dr. Rebecca Sloan, a professor of Appalachian studies at the University of Pikeville who specializes in 19th century mountain communities. Sloan had handled hundreds of photographs from this era. She recognized the studio stamp immediately. J. L. Howard operated out of the Harlan Courthouse Square between 1883 and 1896. But the hand stopped her cold. Sloan contacted a colleague in medical history at the University of Louisville. Based on the visible swelling pattern, the darkened tissue at the interphalangeal joints, and what appeared to be a gummatose lesion, a soft, tumor-like growth on the index finger, the most consistent diagnosis was secondary or early tertiary syphilis. Specifically, the dactylitis and gummatose bone destruction caused by the spirochete trepelma pallidum, an infection that had gone untreated for at least 2 to 3 years before the photograph was taken. Now in the 1880s, syphilis was not merely a disease. It was a moral verdict. Churches expelled members over rumors alone. Families disowned sons. Women who contracted it from their husbands were blamed for the infection. There was no effective treatment. Mercury compounds were widely administered, but often caused more damage than the disease itself. Most sufferers simply concealed the symptoms for as long as they could and died under euphemistic diagnoses. No one spoke the word. Not in public, not in private, and certainly not in a wedding portrait. Sloan also flagged a second detail, the bride's posture. In virtually every wedding portrait from this period, the bride's hand was posed reaching toward the groom, resting on his arm, touching his hand, or at minimum angled in his direction. It was a visual grammar of union and submission. But in this photograph, the bride's gloved hand lies in her lap, rotated slightly outward, away from the groom's body. Sloan put it plainly. That isn't an accident. Someone in that room, the bride, the photographer, or both, made a choice, and it was recorded in silver. But they still didn't have names. Sloan enlisted Tom Whitaker, a retired genealogist in Harlan County who had spent decades assembling a database of mountain families. Using the photographer's known active dates, the approximate ages of the subjects, and a systematic search of Harlan County marriage bonds from 1883 to 1896, Whitaker narrowed the field to 3 possible couples. The match came from the clothing. The bride's lace collar pattern was consistent with a specific style sold through the Montgomery Ward mail-order catalog between 1886 and 1888. Combined with the groom's apparent age, late 20s, the strongest match was a marriage bond filed on March 14, 1887. The groom's name was Silas Porter Tackett. He was 28 years old. The bride was Eliza Jane Combs. She was 17. But when Whitaker searched for the couple in subsequent records, the trail fractured. The 1900 federal census lists Eliza Jane Tackett, marital status, married, living in her parents' household on Clover Fork. No husband present, no children listed, and Silas Tackett does not appear in the same household, the same enumeration district, or the same county. In fact, Silas Porter Tackett does not appear in the 1900 census anywhere in the United States. They were married in March of 1887. They never shared a household. They were never divorced. And the groom's hand displayed the unmistakable signs of a disease that killed with absolute certainty. The question was no longer just what happened to this couple. The question was, who knew before the wedding, and what did they agree to keep silent? But the marriage bond was only the first document. What Tom Whitaker found next in the county ledger books changed the entire meaning of this photograph. To understand this marriage, you have to understand the 2 families it joined, and the economy that made one dependent on the other. Silas Porter Tackett was born in 1859 to one of the more established families on Martin's Fork. His father, Hiram Tackett, operated a small sawmill that supplied timber to the Louisville and Nashville Railroad as it pushed its way deeper into the Kentucky mountains. By the early 1880s, Silas was managing crews, hearing laborers, and traveling regularly to Lexington and Louisville to negotiate contracts. By mountain standards, Silas Tackett was prosperous. He was a man with cash wages in a world that ran on subsistence. And it was likely on one of those trips that the disease found him. Dr. Sloan explained, the timber economy brought mountain men into contact with urban centers in ways that earlier generations had never experienced. Louisville in the 1880s had one of the highest rates of syphilis in the entire Ohio Valley. The red light district along Green Street was well documented by public health boards. A man like Silas, young, salaried, traveling alone for weeks at a time, fit the demographic profile almost exactly. If he contracted the disease in 1883 or 1884, the destructive hand lesions visible in the photograph would have been unmistakable by early 1887. Now consider the bride's family. Eliza Jane Combs was the third of 7 children born to Jeremiah and Sarah Combs on Clover Fork. The 1880 federal census lists Jeremiah's occupation as farmer and his real estate value as 0. He owned nothing, not even the land he worked. He supplemented his farming with seasonal logging labor, frequently for the Tackett sawmill. The Combs family didn't just live near the timber economy. They existed at its mercy, and the Tacketts were the economy. This is where the ledger comes in. Tom Whitaker found it in the Harlan County clerk's office, buried in a box of uncatalogued commercial records donated by a Tackett descendant in the 1970s. It was a sawmill account book covering 1882 to 1889. The entries for Jeremiah Combs showed a running debt, supply advances, equipment loans, small cash draws against future wages, accumulating to a total of $47.60. In 1887, that was roughly 6 months of a laborer's income. Beside his final entry, dated March 1887, someone had written a single word in different ink. Settled. Not paid, not collected. Settled in the same month his 17-year-old daughter married the mill owner's son. Dr. Sloan was direct about what this meant. We have to be honest about what marriage meant in this economy. A daughter was an asset, her labor, her fertility, her alliance value. A family like the Combs had almost nothing to negotiate with except their children. And a man like Silas, visibly declining, aging past marriageability, would have had increasing difficulty attracting a bride through normal courtship. The debt gave both families a reason to make a deal that neither could make on romantic terms. And once the deal was made, the church ensured it would hold. The wedding was performed by Reverend Josiah Pratt of the Clover Fork Regular Baptist Church. These congregations exercised extraordinary social discipline. They convened monthly meetings of business in which members could be tried for moral infractions, drinking, dancing, absence from worship, marital disobedience. Divorce was not merely difficult under Kentucky statute. It was spiritually impermissible. A woman who left her husband without sanctioned cause could be churched, formally expelled from the congregation. That meant the loss of her burial rights, her community standing, and her entire social world. So what did Eliza know? No diary in her hand survives. No letter she wrote has ever been found. But Dr. Sloan pointed to one more detail in the photograph. The bride is wearing full-length gloves, unusual for a mountain wedding where bare hands were far more common. Sloan said, "Gloves were a statement of refinement, yes, but they were also a barrier. Look at the image. His disease is showing. She is making sure hers won't." But there is one surviving document that speaks, almost, in Eliza's voice. Among the papers Catherine Brashear recovered from the Hensley farmhouse was a bundle of correspondence between Eliza's older sister, Martha Combs Hensley, and a cousin who had moved to southwestern Virginia. Most of the letters were mundane, crop reports, births, church news. But one letter dated November 1887, 8 months after the wedding, contained this passage. Eliza is returned home to mother and will not go back. She says the sickness is in his blood and no wife should bear what she has seen. Father is wrathful, but mother holds firm. We do not speak of it in town. In 1887 Appalachia, venereal disease had no polite name. It was referred to obliquely. Bad blood, the sickness, a private affliction. The phrase "in his blood" carried specific weight. It reflected the pre-germ theory belief that such diseases were constitutional, not merely caught but inherent. A corruption of the sufferer's fundamental nature. To say the sickness was in Silas's blood was to declare him ruined in body and soul. And to put those words in a letter, even a private one, was an act of extraordinary risk. Sometime in the autumn of 1887, Eliza Jane Combs Tackett left her husband's home on Martin's Fork and walked back to her parents' cabin on Clover Fork. The distance was roughly 9 miles, through mountain hollows, along creek beds, over ridgelines thick with oak and poplar. She was 17 years old. She had been married for less than 8 months. Under Kentucky statute, she was still Silas Tackett's wife. Her property, if she had any, belonged to him. Her wages belonged to him. Under church covenant, she had abandoned her vows. Under the unwritten code of Harlan County, she had done something almost unheard of for a woman of her class and age. She had refused. And what she was refusing was not just a husband. She was refusing a system, one that had used a debt ledger to arrange her marriage, a church covenant to enforce it, and a wall of silence to conceal the disease that made it monstrous. Now legally, Silas could have fought her. In 1887 Kentucky, a married woman had virtually no independent legal identity. Silas could have petitioned the circuit court to compel her return. He could have charged Jeremiah Combs with harboring. He could have had the marriage enforced by the county sheriff. He did none of these things. And that silence is itself a confession. Dr. Sloan explained why. If Silas had taken this to court, he would have been forced to explain why his wife left, and the only explanation was the one neither he nor his family could afford to enter into the public record. The disease. A legal proceeding would have named his condition under oath. It would have destroyed his family's commercial relationships, their standing in the church, everything the Tackett name was built on. For Silas, silence wasn't mercy, it was self-preservation. So what took shape in late 1887 was a quiet agreement, never written, never formalized, between the Combs and Tackett families. Eliza would remain at her parents' home. No divorce petition would be filed. No public accusation would be made. The Combs' debt would stay settled. And the wedding photograph, the only material evidence that the union had ever been solemnized, would be removed from display and hidden. Not destroyed, hidden. As if both families understood, even then, that evidence carries a weight that outlasts silence. So the photograph went behind the wall. The marriage went unspoken. And Silas Tackett's disease went where every such disease went in 1887, underground, unnamed, and unchecked. Tom Whitaker located the final record in the Kentucky Bureau of Vital Statistics. Silas Porter Tackett died on January 9, 1893. He was 33 years old. The cause of death was listed as general paresis of the insane. This was one of the era's most recognized clinical euphemisms. General paresis, also called general paralysis of the insane, was the terminal neurological stage of untreated syphilis. It meant the spirochete had crossed into the brain. In its final phase, patients suffered hallucinations, seizures, progressive blindness, and total muscular collapse. There was no treatment. There was no recovery. And that death certificate, by using the clinical term without flinching, confirmed what every soul in Harlan County had refused to say out loud for 6 years. Silas Tackett died of syphilis. But Silas was not an anomaly. Surviving medical records from Appalachian Kentucky in the 1880s and 1890s reveal a staggering frequency of diagnoses that every physician who wrote them understood to be syphilitic. General paresis, locomotor ataxia, spinal sclerosis, constitutional debility. Dr. Sloan framed it this way. Conservative estimates suggest that in some rural counties, 1 in 8 adult men may have been infected by 1900. But because the disease was never named honestly, it was never counted accurately. And because it was never counted, it was never addressed with public health measures. Entire communities were being hollowed out by a disease they had collectively voted not to see. Eliza Jane Combs Tackett never remarried. She couldn't, not really. There was no divorce. And even after Silas's death in 1893 technically made her a widow, she never publicly claimed that title. The 1900 census still lists her as married. It took until 1910 for the record to catch up with the truth. That year, she is listed as widow. She lived in her parents' home until their deaths, and then with her sister Martha. She took up work as a seamstress, and eventually she became a lay midwife, one of the few economically independent roles available to a woman in the mountains. Between 1901 and 1928, Eliza is estimated to have attended more than 300 births in Harlan County. She became the person the community called at 2 in the morning when a child was coming. She was trusted with the most intimate moment of a family's life by the same community that had never trusted her with the truth about her own marriage. There is one question the historical record cannot answer. Did Eliza herself contract syphilis? The silence around this is absolute. Syphilis in women was even more aggressively concealed than in men. Symptoms were less externally visible, diagnosis vanishingly rare, and the stigma was annihilating. Eliza lived to 64, unusual but not impossible for someone with brief or limited exposure. Martha's letter says Eliza will not go back after seeing the sickness. It is possible she left before the marriage was physically consummated. It is also possible she didn't. The same wall of silence that protected the Tackett name also erased Eliza's medical reality. The system that hid the disease also hid its victims. Eliza died on April 14, 1934, at the age of 64. Her death certificate lists no spouse, and her grave marker in the Clover Fork Cemetery reads simply, Eliza J. Combs, 1870 to 1934. Not Tackett, Combs. Somewhere between 1887 and 1934, Eliza, or someone who loved her, made a decision. Whatever the law said, whatever the marriage bond recorded, she would go into the ground under her own name. The photograph had done its work. It had waited behind a wall in the dark for over 100 years, holding a truth that no one alive was willing to carry. It passed from Eliza to Martha. From Martha to Martha's daughter, Della Combs Hensley, the last occupant of the farmhouse on Martin's Fork. Della kept it behind the landscape print for decades. Whether she understood what the image revealed or simply inherited her mother's instruction never to display it, we don't know. When Della died in 2011 at 91, she left no note, no explanation, no instructions about the picture hidden on her parlor wall. Just a century of silence, compressed into cardstock and silver. In 2020, Catherine Brashear donated the photograph and the associated documents, including Martha's letters and the sawmill ledger pages Tom Whitaker had photocopied, to the Southeast Kentucky Community and Technical College archives. Dr. Sloan published a peer-reviewed paper in the Appalachian Journal in 2021, examining the photograph as a case study in disease concealment, coerced marriage, and the economics of silence in the late 19th century Mountain South. The paper was covered by regional press outlets, and it sparked something unexpected, a small wave of parallel disclosures. Other Appalachian families reaching out with their own hidden photographs, their own sealed letter bundles, their own stories that had never been spoken aloud. Dr. Sloan put it this way: we tend to imagine epidemics as sudden and visible, something that arrives, is counted, and is fought. But syphilis in Appalachia was an epidemic of silence. It moved through communities not because people didn't recognize it, but because they had constructed an entire social architecture designed to keep it invisible. The church covenant, the marriage contract, the debt ledger, the photograph on the wall, they were all load-bearing elements of the same structure. And the structure's purpose was never to cure the disease. It was to make sure no one ever had to say its name. Look at the photograph one more time. A bride and groom in 1887. His hand on her chair, her hand in her lap. For 100 years, this image sat face down behind a landscape print, sealed in the dark. And the whole time, it was doing the one thing Eliza Jane Combs was never permitted to do in life. It was telling the truth. His hand is a medical record no doctor would write. Her hand is a protest no court would hear. And together, they are the evidence of a world that would sooner hide a dying man inside a wedding suit than admit that something was wrong. Eliza pulled her hand away. It took 132 years for anyone to understand what she was saying. If this story stayed with you, I'd like to hear one thing in the comments. Have you ever found a hidden photograph in a family member's home, and did you ever learn the full story behind it? Because I think there are thousands of pictures like this one, still behind walls, still waiting.